Okay, so hi everyone. I'm Michael Margolis, and thank you, David, for the incredibly generous introduction. I'm the founder and CEO of Storied, and I want to start with the following question, and we'll use this to sort of start to explore these themes of narrative as it relates to education and learning. So the question I have for you all: do leaders have to have faith in the future? If a leader doesn't have faith in the future, do they belong in the seat of leadership? I pose this because one of the things that I've noticed is that most leaders actually really care about wanting to make a difference. They really care about wanting to improve the human experience, wanting to make impact in whatever community, organization, or company that they serve. But the story that they're often telling doesn't articulate faith in the future, right? We're usually obsessed with telling the story of what's wrong, what's broken, what needs to be fixed. Right? And of course, we're all here to make things better. But what I want to explore with you all is introducing you to narrative strategy, narrative thinking, narrative intelligence. I'll give you some examples and some rubrics around this, but ways for how we present our vision for the world, right? Our strategy, what we want to create, the future that we're trying to build, and how to convey that in a way that captures the imagination, in a way that gets people to emotionally self-identify, and in a way that overcomes the obstacles and barriers of resistance that come with anything that's new or disruptive. So 21st century learners, these are just some of the various different mindsets, aptitudes, competencies that from what I know in my time with you, David, and what I know of ISB, these are the types of mindsets and aptitudes that are part of your curriculum. This is the kind of learners that you're trying to teach and grow and develop and empower. And this, in many ways, is the future you're trying to sell to parents, right? Because this is the kind of child that they want their child, or rather, this is the kind of child a parent wants their child to be in some regard. And this is very much, the kinds of aspirational values and mindsets and skills that inform how we think about narrative intelligence. So narrative intelligence is something I describe and discuss in my last book called Story 10X. At the end of our session today, I'll let you know a way you guys can all get a free digital copy of that book, but you can also find it on Amazon and on Kindle and Audible and all those things. So what is narrative intelligence? Narrative intelligence is developing the capacity, a conscious awareness of being able to shape the stories that shape you. Right? Think of it as co-authorship, being able to author your life, your profession, your reality. It's being able to sell an ambitious and disruptive future. It's being able to lead complex change and transformation. It's being able to unlock human and cultural potential. And fundamentally, it's being able to persuade and influence with integrity. So this is a tall order. All right, like what does this actually mean and look like in action? So we're going to get into this, but I've always been inspired by this quote by Plato, who says, "Those who tell the stories rule the world." So we know this as educators, and as anthropologists and sociologists and whatever profession and training you come from, the power of language, the power of rhetoric, the power of communications. And the challenge these days is, we used to have a very few elite that told the stories of our lives. Storytelling's now been democratized, right? The challenge, though, is we don't know who to trust and what to believe, because here comes everybody. So something that used to be very structured, right, including the way that we approached education, now everybody has a story. Everybody has a story worth telling. You've got 1,001 platforms for telling your story. And things like social media, for better and for worse, have not only democratized storytelling, but they've established a fundamental universal value, if not a universal right, that everybody has a story and everybody wants to tell their story. And this is changing the dynamics of education. It's changing the dynamics of the marketplace. It's changing everything. And so how do you speak to the story that a child is trying to tell about themselves in their life? How do you speak to the story that a parent is trying to tell about their family or the future they're trying to create for their child? How do you tell the story of your school and your philosophy and the kind of impact that you want to bring to your local community? So to tell you a little bit about Storied as a firm, we specialize in disruption. We're a strategic messaging company. And when it comes to disruption, category level disruption, technological disruption, cultural disruption, when the world changes, we have to change our story to reflect that new world. And 2020, if anything, has taught us, or we've seen, disruption become democratized. So after a very challenging first quarter of this year, it has been just absolute bonkers for us in terms of the demand for our work. And right, because everybody with disruption, everybody needs that new story. What does it actually look like? It ranges everything from building narratives and doing differentiation, positioning, messaging work. We've recently added insights, doing qualitative research. We have an ethnographer on our team with 15 years experience who does amazing work. We then also do cultural activation. Once we build a narrative for a team or an organization, that the power of that narrative is only as strong as how many people accept that narrative as their truth. So we do a lot of work facilitating different ranges of stakeholders inside organizations and communities in how they develop a relationship to that larger narrative. And then lastly, not only do we build narratives, but we train on our methods and tools. And we've been doing that for almost 20 years with storytelling and narrative at the heart, but obviously it moves into leadership, influence, change, and so on. Some quick examples of our work. This one I pulled out, I thought you guys might appreciate, but we've done work with NASA in helping to preserve a 20 million science, technology, engineering, math education program for middle schools across the country. We've done work over several years around the future of public libraries and a sector-wide storytelling initiative, toolkit, and training. We've done work. We do work with a lot of big companies like Roche. We're right now helping to lead a quality transformation. So literally establishing a new paradigm for how they take something really complex and technical like quality and how it changes how they run their business, not only inside Roche, but the entire biotech pharma industry. And then we've also spent a lot of time in the last 6 years working deep inside Facebook, the biggest storytelling platform in the history of the universe. Everything from working with the group's product team and building their narrative on the structure of belonging, which ended up actually influencing a change in their company mission statement, to building a narrative for Messenger Kids, helping parents navigate social media and how to help their kids thrive online, to building the social impact narrative for how 5 million nonprofits around the world can unlock all of these tools. So these are just a few of the different examples of the kind of work that we do. All right, so now that you guys have that context, let's shift gears for a bit. And I constantly think of narrative from this perspective of change, right? When the world changes, we have to change our story to reflect that new world. Well, as many of us know and recognize, most education is preparing people for a world that no longer exists, right? This is the disruption that education is facing, and how each of you as educators are conveying what is the future of learning and how your school approaches this new context. It means there's a lot of new wayfinding to be done. And for myself, so actually, before I tell you a little bit about my own sort of personal story and background, what I'll say about narrative, think of narrative, and this is a metaphor that sometimes people appreciate, is narrative as a GPS. So narrative on one hand is a location device. question is, where are we? Right? This is the question that any audience is asking themselves. Where am I? Do I belong in this story? Narrative is also a transportation vehicle. It takes us places. And the question is, where's that narrative taking us? And do we want to go there? Location device, transportation vehicle. These are two really critical points of geolocation for how you build a new narrative and convey that for a range of different audiences and stakeholders. So speaking of locating oneself, this is me as a child. I actually grew up in Lausanne, Switzerland, first 9 years of my life. And when I was 9 years old, my family moved to a foreign land. We moved to Los Angeles, California. I'm still recovering. So imagine Swiss lederhosen boy, right, in surfer skater culture of Southern California in 1986. And I was a nerd before it was cool to be a nerd. Right. So I struggled with trying to fit in and belong in every which way. For me, a good day was being picked second to last out on the schoolyard. Right. I was just miserable day in and day out. But my salvation was actually the influence of my parents. So this was the family motto that my mother, Leslie, wrote and put on the wall. Our home is an exploratorium. There are no rules on what or how to create. There's no one saying you can't do that, it's too crazy, or we already tried that before. There's only imagination, the everyday materials of life, and our willingness to explore them. So imagine growing up in a household where this is the family motto. And this is the kind of stuff that we would build. My mother had a name for it. What other people considered trash, she called super junk. We'd go to garage sales and secondhand stores and all of these sort of Deritus materials. We would build things. We would build worlds in a box. This is an antique sewing box that we turned into a pirate ship. And not to be outdone, this is my father, Jeff. He is a mad scientist, an inventor, and an engineer. He's got 30 patents to his name, was born and raised in the bush of Africa in Rhodesia, or Zimbabwe today, just north. And he went to the University at Cape Town. And then my mother is a teacher, an artist, and a toy designer. Right. So think of my dad as like Doc Brown from Back to the Future, and my mom is like Mary Poppins on acid. Except both of my parents are total squares. They've never done drugs a day in their life, right? So this is the iconoclastic family that I grew up in, where creativity ruled the roost. But I also saw time and time again, my parents, in each of their own unique genius, struggle with how to communicate their vision, their innovations, their imagination, how to communicate and translate that into cultural acceptance. My father worked for Nestle for 20 years. That's what put us into Switzerland. He's had many commercial successes. He's had 10 times more commercial failures. My mother has invented hundreds of games and toys, and equally has struggled, though, about this translation process. So perhaps it's not an accident that I always like to say, many of us were our parents' medicine, right? I'm this mutant love child between these two characters. And my obsession is how to translate anything that is world-changing, anything that's innovative, how to translate that into culture. But my experience is forged out of being lost in translation. And I bring this up because I think from what I know, the thin slice I know about ISB is you have a lot of students who feel lost in translation because they're third culture kids. So they have actually a lot of privilege. They have really remarkable life experiences, but they're also lost in translation. They don't know where they truly fit in or belong because they bridge so many different worlds. Right? And then we now live in a world and a future where we all get to choose our own adventure. We have more opportunity than ever before, and it can be overwhelming and bewildering to find your way, right? And whatever pressures they may have from their family of certain paths to take versus all the things that are sort of presented at the all-you-can-eat buffet of life that is the 21st century. All right, so what is the structure of belonging in the digital age? I'm going to skip over this, although the one thing I just want to plant a seed, this is something we could spend a lot more time geeking out on, but as it relates to narrative, the thing I want you to think about is 3 spheres of identity: the story of self, the story of tribe, and the story of the collective. 3 different spheres of identity. Story of self, in your case, might be your students. Story of tribe might be the family. Story of the collective might be the school. Or it could be the story of self would be your teachers. The story of tribe could be the school and then story of the collective could be this association or collective, a community of practice that you all come together in these. These are a few examples. We tend to do a lot of work at all 3 of these spheres: working with leaders and change agents, working with a functional discipline like a product or design organization, or working with a business unit, and then sometimes we're also working at the company or sectoral level. All right. What do I want to? Couple last things to share with you all. So you can tell by now, I'm the product of an unconventional path, but I'm an educator, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I'm a philosopher when it comes to really looking at the fundamental nature of storytelling, of narrative, how the stories we tell make the world. I'm a student of the mythic, the poetic, and the alchemic, but I'm fascinated with how this translates into social institutions, into the world of business. My experience, though, is forged out of this defining construct of being the outsider, the heretic, who didn't fit in or belong anywhere. And I spend a lot of time talking about that in my book and today as well, because this is the fundamental theme of disruption. And it used to be being an outsider or a heretic was a very rare member of society. Because if you were an outsider or a heretic, you were destined to die. You were destined to be an outcast, and you wouldn't last that long out in the desert or out in the forest. But we're becoming a society that now obsesses about the disruptor, about the rebel and the heretic. Those are our new culture heroes. And so it brings up a really interesting question as educators. How do you breed those 21st century learning values of ingenuity, of optimism, of resilience, while education is also about conformity, or certainly about finding your place within society? And there's a real creative tension that we're finding right now around individualism and collectivism. And I think a lot of this has to do with helping people to embrace the part that is their individual uniqueness, but also to feel connected to something larger than self. So, with all of these crazy ideas, I've been chronically unemployable, which means I've always had to invent and create the new. My first career, I was a social entrepreneur working on poverty, race, and the digital divide, but something was missing from the conversation. And this led me to now almost 20 years in this learning laboratory around strategic storytelling. And it's based on this fundamental notion that narrative is the number one determinant of value creation. Right? Everything is story. And so how do we build our narrative intelligence and understanding what does that mean and how to apply it? We've worked with leaders and teams, 30,000 people we've trained, hundreds of organizations, 34 industries, a dozen countries. And our mission is to teach the world how to think in narrative, which is why when David reached out about this, I was thrilled to have a chance to connect with you all. A huge part of our mission is looking at how does narrative intelligence ultimately find its way as a foundational rubric of 21st century education, right? Where it's taught in every school, in every corporate university, in every leadership development program, right? Think of all the emphasis that's put on the importance of communications and developing communication skills, right? Presentation skills, writing skills, critical thinking skills. So much is communications today. but there's very little that's really helping young people, much less leaders, develop a gestalt around narrative. All right, I want to leave you with a couple rubrics, and we can use these as springboards for your breakouts and conversations. So this is one of our foundational rubrics. It's called the SFB storytelling formula. And this really came about out of wrestling and struggling with a lot of the ways that we typically build narratives in business today. Problem solution, starting with what's wrong, leading with the facts and the data. Right? If you start with the data and conclusions, the story is often dead on arrival because our audience doesn't have context for that data and they're not emotionally invested, or they don't self-identify in the story yet. Right? Or if we start with the problem, we are often speaking with an audience where we do not have shared problem definition, or two, our audience is complicit, if not responsible, for the problem itself. Right? So this is one of our root cause diagnoses about why we come into conflict while we're trying to create change or transformation, because we're rhetorically structuring the narrative in a way that's inviting people to reject, inviting people to opt out or exit. So with that in mind, I want to give you a couple quick storytelling hacks, and the book goes into much greater detail on these things. But here's the SFB storytelling formula, which is, number one, people have to see it and they have to feel it before they can believe it. See it, feel it, then believe it. Another way to think about this, and this is a bit of a reframe. We often think of storytelling as beginning, middle, and end, past, present, future. What I want to encourage you to explore and to really flex in your work is tell the future, present, past story. We start with the future first, right? And then ultimately, we're only using the past to legitimize the future we're trying to create. Right? And this is critical when trying to create transformation, because if we start with the past, we're often trapped in the past. If we start in the past, we often do not have the benefit of the attention of our audience to ultimately get to the future in our punchline. So there's many different reasons behind this. And then sort of to expand on this, so we play a lot with the rules of three. So see it, feel it, believe it. Future, present, past. This is the most important one I want to make sure that you leave with. You can also think about this as context, emotion, and evidence, right? Context, zoom out, big picture. Emotion, zoom in, get really close and personal. And then evidence is grounded in current reality. And then lastly, these exact same principles actually come to discover through inductive and deductive experimentation that these actually also correspond with Aristotle's three proofs of rhetoric: ethos, pathos, and logos. Right? If any of you are familiar with those. The key, though, is you need to build your narrative in this order: ethos, pathos, logos. And people who are deep into rhetoric recognize this, but within the vernacular, people often throw these around. The other distinction I would make is that ethos, while yes, you can think of ethos as the personal character of an individual, there's another definition of ethos that I find even more powerful and revealing to building narratives. And that is that ethos is also about the collective aspiration of a culture, the collective aspiration of a culture, of a time, or a place. So ethos is also about dreams. It's about ideals. It's about the future you're trying to create. Pathos is about empathy. What are we getting people to self-identify with? And then logos is the proof, the data, the evidence that supports the promise that we're selling. All right, so I've got one big question for you all, and then if we want, David, I've got five there are five influencing strategies that people could also use as a springboard into the breakouts. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, so first question I have, how are you building narrative intelligence for your school? Whether that's in your admissions process in terms of how you're selling the vision and philosophy of your school, whether that's in the academic learning experience of your students, right? Or any other way that our conversation today has inspired your thinking. How are you building narrative intelligence? My hope is that part of what I've shared with you is simply many things you're already doing just by a different name. And that there are things that have been presented that might help you connect the dots in how do you present a holistic rubric around narrative and around communications and identity, and what relevance that has for 21st century learning. Okay, so that's the big question. And then for unlocking your narrative, this is what we do with our clients when we're building a strategic narrative, is we look at these five questions. Number one, possibility. So start from the place of what's possible today that wasn't before 3 or 5 years ago. And this is really, this has even more credence in the context of COVID, where digital transformation advanced 10 years in the last 6 months. We see this with a lot of the clients. We do a lot of work in Silicon Valley and with big tech, as well as a lot of other institutions. The pace of digital transformation, including online learning and the role of technology, right? So what's possible now that wasn't before? That's the first question that can help to unlock your narrative. The second is inevitability. Where is the world going? Like, where is it inevitable? This is the future. This is where we're going to get to. And the question is, do we want to be on the leading edge of this, or do we want to be reacting and trailing behind? Number three, irresistibility. What does everybody want more of? Right. Think back to some of those 21st century learner attributes that I named, or there are many that may come to mind for you. Irrefutability. What proof do you have that no one can deny about this future, about these possibilities? And then lastly, undeniability. What makes it difficult, if not impossible, to reject the promise that you're selling? So I thought I would offer those up as possibly some conversation starters or springboards. And with that, I hand things back over to you, David.
I popped into some of the conversations, and the things that I was hearing was some kind of deep thinking around what it is that we are trying to do in the enrollment management sphere, in telling the stories of our schools, whether it's through social media, through that admissions experience, and somehow the wrestling also with the complexity of this. It feels like one of the things that is coming out in that is this idea of, and I think I heard in one group, almost the permission to tell the future story first, which is something that maybe is a shift, and certainly was a shift in some of my own thinking, and resonated very, very much in Twitter length summaries. Are there other things that you want to kind of throw into the conversation as some of those takeaways or connection points or next steps that were coming out of today's conversation?
We all have a story to tell, and all the stories are about how we fit in everybody else's story.
That was almost exactly 140 characters. Well done. Anyone else?
I'd love to hear Michael just comment on, I don't want to get into politics, but I'm just curious, this ability to use stories not only for good, but for the opposite. I mean, there seems to be a skill out there that I think you mentioned in your presentation, that it's getting difficult for consumers, whether they have schools or of news or anything, to differentiate between stories that have integrity and those that don't. You did say part of narrative intelligence is persuading with integrity. How does one fight that? How does one, it could be, maybe there's a competitor school in the area, or maybe it could be something else that's out there, but are you advising other institutions about how, when people are using the tactics that you shared, but not necessarily for good?
So I guess a couple of things, Alex. One, there's always competing narratives, right? In any context, in any situation, even in our own families and households, there are competing narratives. Even in our own heads, there are competing narratives. The idea of how story is used for good or bad is as timeless as human creation. What is different is the ways in which technology has accelerated and magnified the process and scale by which we're all participating more actively in that whole cycle. It's just moving a lot faster at a much greater platform of complexity. And so to me, really, ultimately, part of narrative intelligence has to do with like the ethics of narrative and understanding, right, the distinctions behind intention, unintended consequences. There's a whole other element to working with narrative, which is how do you hold this power responsibly? In terms of like its practical application, when you are dealing with something that's highly political, there's two things. One that we look at is how do we make it difficult, if not impossible, for people to continue to tell the old story or the opposing story? Not in an adversarial way, but in a way that neutralizes. Right. That often happens, by the way, just simply because the moment you present a new story, anybody who lives in the old story is likely to feel wrong, bad, judged, stupid, or defensive. So this is actually built into our foundational rubrics, which is how to tell an undeniable story, how to make it irresistible, irrefutable, undeniable. By going back to universal truths. What is it that everybody wants? Right? And then creating an emotional experience where we discover, you know what, we're more similar than different in some small way. Right? And then providing the psychological and emotional safety of, hey, here's the ways in which you can count on this message being true and how we deliver on that. So it's built into our frameworks, and and the reality is then its application, that I think this is just a place in our, frankly, just collective human evolution right now, like in the human experiment, where we're learning the role of narrative and storytelling at just a completely next level. And the most powerful thing I think we can do as educators is to instill this narrative intelligence into as many human beings as possible, and to trust that as the self-regulating mechanisms of people having more agency and discernment, again, being able to shape the stories that shape us. One thing, so two quick things if I can, David. I don't know if we have a hard stop here. So one thing I want to do is just let you guys know, if you would like a digital copy of the book, just email me here at michaelm@getstory.com. You can go to Amazon and get a print copy, Kindle, Audible, and so on. We do lots of keynotes and trainings. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, Michael Margolis, or if you want to talk about your narrative needs, feel free to book a strategy session. I'll leave this up, and I'll sort of finish with a closing thought, which is one of the challenges with disruption is, how do you talk about the future when you may not have visibility or line of sight of knowing what the new state will be like? Right? Because we're all still adapting to what's the future of learning and education in this environment, in this context. What you can talk about, though, are the vectors of where the world's going. What you can talk about as admissions people is, what are you hearing from parents? What are their dreams and desires? What are their wants? That's a place where you have not only permission, but that's a place of authority for you to claim. Right? As you talk to the rest of your peers, well, let me tell you, this is what parents are asking for. This is what parents are wrestling with. This is what parents are hoping to get out of this educational and learning experience. Be their surrogate and platform of conveying the parent and child story to the rest of your school. And that can be a really powerful leverage of influence. And then the last thing, everybody have all my contact information, whatever else, right? You guys all have this? Okay, cool. So I'll leave you with this following quote: "Great stories happen to those who can tell them." And the opportunity you all have with ISB is that there are aspects of your curriculums, of your philosophy, things that you've been working on and building over the last 3, 5, or 10 years that actually have been prescient for the times that we're in right now. There are ways you've been ahead of the curve. I know that's true for each and every single one of you, right? From what I know of David, from what I know of ISB, and for you to be a part of this cohort. Tell the story of the things that you already anticipated. Like, yes, it's not easy. Yes, there's all these unknowns. But guess what? Adapting to this new future, this is not some pivot that you're suddenly starting going 0 to 1 from like a standing start. You've been working on this for the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. You're positioned, you have a springboard to adapt into this new environment. It's like the environment is simply accelerating the things that you've already believed in and that you've been working on. Find that through line, and that's the basis of your undeniable story.
Well, Michael, that's not only a perfect place to end today's session, right on time. It's probably arguably the best place to end 2020, which has been, let's say, an unusual year. And we're going to end season 2 of these virtual drinks on that high note. Over the last few weeks, we've been, had that connection with people in fields of innovation, psychology, neuroscience, storytelling, futurism, etc. And I think it's been a bit of a round the world tour of great ideas and great thinkers. And I think one of the things that I've benefited from in doing that is that it's lifted our eyes a little bit beyond the day-to-day management of running schools in a global pandemic. And I think that brings us back to this idea of hope. And I think, Michael, you've given us, as other people in these sessions, hope. And so one of the things I'd like to just leave with you, apart from wishing you all well as you enter the holiday season, is to think about, because this is your group as much as anybody's, where do you want to take season 3? What's going to be useful for you? How do you want to connect? And who are the people that are going to be our traveling companions? So think of those things. I'm gonna one more time raise a glass to Angela, because Angela, you've been such a fantastic colleague. We've really enjoyed getting to know you better through these times. We're going to come and see you in Monaco, and we hope that you will stay there. Maybe you won't. You're on mute at the moment, Angela. So if you might decide to.
I do have a drink, which is the bottle that I got from the International School of Amsterdam, which was my first overseas conference with this school. So it seems a fitting place to have my drink. I will be taking these ideas forward into the next, whatever my next destination is. So I really hope I'm going to see you all again. I have not any intention of leaving this sort of profession. It's just a temporary goodbye from this school. So I'll send you all a personal email address in the course of time. And really, thanks, David, for everything, for these meetings, which have been wonderful, and for everybody's wonderful ideas. So cheers to that.
Cheers, everybody. And have a great few weeks. Get some rest is the only advice I can give over the December breaks, because we can't go anywhere. So sleep is the next best option. So take care, Michael. Thanks again.
You're welcome,
please,
everyone.
If you
Thank you.
download his book, it is a fantastic read. So if you, obviously all of that will be on the information, and if you didn't catch it, I've got Michael's email address and I can pass it on to you. So have a good rest of your evening and day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy holidays,
Thank
everyone.
you. Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.